to you, and what's going to keep you awake at night over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And then Santosh Veda, who has become a good friend of mine over the past couple years, represents Dominion, and his role at Dominion is actually right now rolling out a DERMS. So he can share the trials and tribulations and headaches and heartburn and crying, lots of crying, on rolling out a DERMS. And then from there, we want to kind of throw it back out to the group, and let's kind of work through like some questions that we collectively put together that said, okay, if you're in this journey, like some questions that you need to be thinking about, right? Barriers, hurdles, pushback, stakeholders, things of that nature. So we want to try to take that second kind of 2/3 of our session and really make it more collaborative and kind of group think this thing through here, right? A little crowdsourcing. So with that said, I'll jump in. So you think you want a DERMS? Okay, God bless you. All right. So the grid services business, I'll just give a quick overview. The grid services business was really born out of an acquisition that Gererac made October will be 3 years ago with a company formerly known as, or the artist formerly known as Hebah, which was a software company based out of Vancouver, British Columbia. But our key piece here is to really be kind of in that intersection between utility programs, wholesale markets, and groups that are looking to monetize assets that are going out there, right? And we see this more and more, especially being kind of in that middle as a hardware and software provider. We're seeing a lot of assets. I actually have the pleasure of sitting on the ADER task force here in Texas at the request of the PUC. And I shared with them a stat about, 3 months ago, that just here in Texas alone, Generac has sold more than 470,000 assets. Thermostats, water heater controls, big generators, home standby generators, batteries, right? And of that 470, which now I think is 500,000, we've already crossed the half million mark, less than 10% are involved in any type of utility program. Right? And that is crazy because those assets just sit idly by most of their life, especially generators, right? So we're trying to help kind of bring this transformation together between what's going on out there behind the meter and in some cases in front of the meter, and the fact that these resources could be used to help solve grid problems. We kind of sit in a group called the Energy Technology Group within the broader Generac family. We have connected devices, which is ecobee. Some of you may have heard of that thermostat, kind of an up-and-coming product with about 4 million devices in homes across the country. There's the clean energy business, which not a lot of people knew about because they think Generac, they immediately think fossil gen, home standby generators. That's become synonymous, kind of like Kleenex. But yep, we do have a clean business, and they are actually producing residential batteries. And then there's the grid services, right? And we kind of tie it all together. So let's jump right into this. So what we're going to talk about is kind of 3 different things to kind of level set everybody on like where our head's at when we think about this. And this will kind of help set the stage for the workshopping piece of this on the back end, right? The first is the DRMS. It's the DERMS without the E, right? Santosh and I had a good chuckle about that last night. It's like everybody calls it DERMS, whether it's a DRMS or a DERMS. I'm like, that's funny. You're right. It's just without the E. But the bottom line is, key takeaway, it's a little bit on the screen here, but right, what it really is really a software that is taking care of load management, right? And in a lot of cases, right, it is kind of that soup to nuts or cradle to grave, right, from recruiting to enrollment, enablement, actual control of the devices, and then also providing the incentive on the back end, whether it's a rebate or an on-bill type of structure or Amazon gift card, whatever the case may be, right? So DRMS in our minds is kind of that program, soup to nuts type of platform that's out there, right? And honestly, when I even think about it, I'll take it even simpler. I think of DRMS, I think about capacity across an entire footprint, right? Like all of ERCOT or all of Austin Energy, all the city of Austin, right? Then there's the DERMS, which, right, with the proliferation of both in front of the meter and behind the meter resources, right, we're seeing a need to not only take care of that system-wide, but when I think DERMS, I immediately think very point-specific. It's a locational type of solution that we're providing, right? It's not the entire city of Austin. It's one portion of South Congress, or it's out by the airport, or it's another spot over here on the north side of campus, of UT campus, right? It's very specific, and it goes beyond just capacity. You now dive into the realms of actually solving for other use cases, right? More voltage and power management, not just, hey, turn all the shit off and I hope it stays off, at least for the next 3 hours, because we need it, right? So that's what we think about when we think about the actual DERMS side of things, right? Very point specific and beyond just your traditional use case of turn it on, turn it off, right? Or even more importantly, moving the needle both up and down, right? Because in our traditional DRMS, it's always been just turn it off. We don't need it. But we're starting to see, mainly in California, hell, we're seeing it even here in Texas along the I-35 corridor. There are times of day when we actually need resources to actually take energy off the grid because we're producing too much, right? And let's be honest, the last thing we want to do is turn solar panels off. Doesn't quite fit the narrative, right? So this last one, right, is around what we would call DRMS-based device program. And I think the easiest way to think about it, right, when you see that, or when I see that, and what I would convey to you is, think of bring your own thermostat, right? It's a BYOT. So you're basically putting a program together, and you just need a platform to control that device or that group of devices. Again, regardless of vendor, right? It can be BYOTs are very good about most of them around, hey, we don't care if it's Ecobee or Nest or Amazon or Emerson, you name it, right? But we just need to control the thermostats, right? And that kind of becomes a problem, and we can, Santosh and I can have a good debate up here that will probably be very funny for some, but like around, right, having specific aggregation platforms or DRMS device program, DRMS-based device programs that are like, these are just for batteries, this is just for thermostats, this one's just for water heaters, oh, by the way, this one's just for EVs, and oh, by the way, now I've got to control all of that at some head end at the top. Oh, and then I've got to connect it to my OT, my ADMS, and now I've got to be able to control all this, and oh, make it work seamlessly. Has it got to work seamlessly? So when you think of that, and when that middle box right there, just think BYO, like a BYOT. Real quick, just on the control and functionality piece, right? Like we've kind of gone through and looked at some of this. And again, when I look at the DERMS column, that's where I really say that we go beyond just turning things off, right? We are now looking at frequency regulation, arbitrage, or secondary reserve is like what we call it in Germany and Australia, right? And we're moving into actually solving for voltage level because, right, now we actually have four-way or four-quadrant smart inverters that can actually be used to solve for reactive power problems, right? So in our minds, when you get into these types of use cases, not only is it more of a DERMS need, right, and a DERMS needing to be there to send those set points ahead of time or in cycles versus seconds in as far as the latency is concerned, but you also have to now think about the fact that, these are very discrete level problems that have to be solved at the point, not at some centralized head-end system. Right, and so sending these instructions ahead of time in the case of primary frequency, and telling these assets, when you sense this, this is what you have to do. This is how you respond, right? And so, again, the other beauty part of this that I think we are starting to have these conversations here in Texas. We're already doing this overseas, but we're having these conversations here in Texas. Is in those first 3 rows, if you will, that's really. And I'll say this from a battery perspective, right? Those are the ones where people are like, well, that's all they can do. They can just provide that, and so we're just going to compensate you for that, right? But when you move down and being able to do active power and reactive power and voltage, right, there is inherent value in these resources being out there. The problem that most of the utilities right now are dealing with is that they don't know how to assign a value to that, right? So if you're a homeowner, you have a Tesla or a power cell or an N-phase battery or electric battery, right? Yeah, you might get paid so many dollars per kW to provide capacity, But how much more could you be paid if you were actually providing capacity at that local substation outside of the normal call window, or that you're providing voltage support at a certain point in time, right, when the grid really needs it, because you're doing that and your neighbor's doing that and several other neighbors are doing that. It actually is providing grid stability, right? And there's a value there, but just no one's yet to really be able, other than on the transmission side of the footprint, has ever been able to really quantify how much is a VAR, right? And so DERMS is hopefully going to get us moving in that direction. From an engagement side, again, the DRMS-based device program is really good at that, right? I mean, you think about it, right? There are platforms out there that do a really good job of really just soup to nuts, right? There's a landing page that a consumer can go to. They can put their information in, their serial number, take a picture of their serial number. It pulls all that information in, and boom, they're populated. They're ready to be in. They're in the program, ready to be controlled at a moment's notice. In-app enrollments, right? Our friends at Ecobee, right? They actually have, and I'm sure some other thermostat vendors as well. There's in-app, right? If you turn on like here in Austin, because I know they have a program, you put on your Ecobee today. As soon as you commission it, you're going to get a little in-app notification going, "Hey, you want to enroll? Here's the program requirements." You can click the button, and congratulations, you're enrolled. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my partner in crime here from Zpryme, and she's going to talk about why are we transitioning to DERMS.
I don't know if I can answer the question, but I'll try. So, like JT said, we partnered with Generac, Zpryme partnered with Generac to conduct this research and produce this infographic that we have here. Thank you. And as you all know, the industry is undergoing major changes where the consumer is now a prosumer. DERs are increasingly being integrated into the grid, and there's a high turnover of leadership and workforce in the industry. And so the objective of this research was to look at how utilities are interacting with their assets, whether or not they can reduce their communication methods, and where the prosumer stands in all of this. And what is the cost of integrating all these DR management systems? What are the challenges of integrating these tools? And really, with the recent leadership turnover, it was important to look at where newcomers, new decision makers in the industry stand with integrating new DR management solutions. So bottom line, the research looks at where the industry stands in terms of the states of current and future deployment of DR management solutions, what are the costs, and what challenges are decision makers looking to address with DR management solutions. So we released this survey to our list, or our database, and we collected over 50 responses. And from the results show that the overwhelming majority here plan to implement DERMS within the next 5 years of responses. Actually, my apologies, the overwhelming majority are not implementing DERMS, but those who are considering DERMS are plan to implement it within the next 5 years. And so when asked about the biggest challenges to implement a DR management system, or the biggest challenges to organizations that they hope to address with DERMS is load management and flexibility. And this can be addressed with DERMS, but it also can be addressed with DRMS-based device programs. Moving on to the next slide, the biggest challenges to implementing DR management systems, of course, is cost. It is expensive to invest. It is a costly investment to integrate DR management systems. But then we also asked people who are not looking to integrate DERMS or implement DERMS within the next 5 years. Even those who plan to implement DERMS within the next 5 years, it's at the moment, currently, they are not considering it as an option. 67%, which is a very high percentage, say that it's not enough distributed energy resources on the grid. So that means that most utilities are not in the right place at the moment to where they can justify the costly investments to implement true DER management systems. And with this, I hand it back to JT. Oh, Santosh, sorry.
Like JT mentioned, I've been in the DERMS program manager role at Dominion for a year and a half. But before coming to Dominion, I worked for National Renewable Energy Lab. For folks that are not familiar, it's one of the national labs, Department of Energy's national lab that focuses on renewable energy, which meant, how do we upgrade the grid control center in order to enable DERs and so on. And some of what I'm going to present includes a lot of that perspective as well. Like I mentioned, I work for Dominion Energy Virginia. We supply 2.7 million customers. We are in the middle of a grid transformation plan. So this was part of the Virginia Assembly coming up with the Grid Transformation and Security Act in 2019, which required a lot of investments in distribution systems. So we're really modernizing everything in the control room, but also like deploying, first full-scale deployment within our territory. We're also, deploying a new ADMS system. We're also upgrading our JAS system. So all of these acronyms that you see in the control center, they're all being upgraded as we speak. And the DERMS is part of it. And, like the questions that Hebah presented before, like the regulatory challenges and the cost of deployment and what is the value of doing it, we did face a lot of those questions and scrutiny as well. And I think we have some pretty good answers on that. So yeah, that's my role from before. So this is from our filing. So what is DERMS to us, right? The one thing you will notice is that if you went to Distributech or any of these places, there is no consensus on what a DERMS is, but there has never been for any of these systems in the past, right? I mean, unlike energy management system on transmission side, ADMS or DMS or SCADA on the distribution side, they've never been like one definition that we have all agreed upon as an industry. So I would almost say I would challenge the utility and the participants here to kind of drop the acronym for a minute, but then ask the question of what do you want to do with, with managing DER? Again, when we say DER, we are taking the FERC definition. As you know, the FERC ruling 2222 came out a couple of years ago, requiring DERs to participate in the bulk grid market, like coal or nuclear generators, which means anything, even an aggregation of Tesla vehicles, if they come up to 100 kilowatt, they can participate in the capacity market, frequency regulation, and things like that. So that's to your point, JT, is that there's a lot of value being realized at the distribution level. Again, it's monetized at the bulk level, but there is there is this path that's going. We're going towards that particular approach. The key is we have, like JT mentioned, the DRMS deals with demand response, which is that little box in the middle. At the very bottom, all the buildings. But then there are all these assets on the distribution system that are also resources for grid operations. In the past, we have treated them almost as a nuisance, right? Where we would say, how much can we tolerate? What is the hosting capacity? But that mentality isn't going to help us, modernize our grids. If our consumers want electric vehicles, if they want to charge a Tesla at whatever high value that they're charging, we should be able to enable that. If there are electric water heaters, if people want to decarbonize and electrify their loads, we should be able to provide as a utility. And I think that's where this view comes in, where it really is how do we enable our customers to do what they want, while also there are these push, in a regulatory sense of, be it electrification or decarbonization and things like that. So how do we help get there? And our solution is DERMS. Again, we don't have to get fixated on the acronym itself, but what it means is, what are your views on how you want to manage these resources, and how do you leverage them for grid flexibility? And again, with demand response, it comes with a very narrow view of, there is system peak, and you want to reduce the load to help support the grid. And typically, these resources get called 30 times or 40 times a year, only when there is system peak. but then most of the time we tolerate them. Whereas with the DERMS, we can actually use them for leveraging for improving our grid flexibility. For example, we have a huge electric school bus program. When I say huge, we started off with electric school bus programs 3 years ago with IIJA. We are expecting to see an acceleration of electric school bus adoption. During 3 months in summer, the school buses are just sitting by themselves. In my previous life at NREL, when we did some research, what we learned is what kills the battery is if you charge the battery at 80%, and if you leave it, if it does nothing, and if it just sits in the parking lot, that's what kills the battery faster. And so during summer, we can use our school bus fleets to do V2G services. And we already have some pilot programs underway to test the V2G. And there, the DERMS is going to enable us to pull when to deploy the V2G services. What services are we looking for? Things like that. So that's another example where our school districts want to electrify their school bus fleets. Now we get to use them as another lever for the grid operators. The same is the case with all the other systems. So with energy storage, we have seen a very big growth in energy storage interconnection requests. We have few hundreds of megawatts of energy storage waiting to be interconnected. And you're very aware with batteries, they're tremendous, right? They're very flexible resources. But they also can go from -100 to +100. So if you have a 4 megawatt battery, they can go from -4, where you're charging or maybe consuming, to doing the opposite on the other side when just flip off a button, which means that you're going to see these huge changes, and you want to be able to monitor those. For folks that are familiar with the way grid operates, the grid doesn't like step changes, right? Because it's a physical system, and the minute there's a step change, everything else is responding to it. So how do we make sure that these energy storage, introducing these new assets, doesn't cause issue to the grid itself? So that's another use case for the DERMS that we have. In other words, I think it really changes your view about what do you want to do with all of these DERs and DRs in the future. And you start with visibility, but you also want to be able to control them and leverage them, especially if those assets are owned by the utility itself. And I think that's our view on the DERMS as a whole, right? It really helps us get to that point of how do we treat these as assets to the grid, where both the users, the owners, can benefit from having those, but so can the utility. And how do we make sure that we pass on the fact that we're not upgrading lines and there is cost savings for the customers, and at the end of the day, it's our ratepayers. And I think an investment into DERMS would definitely help us get there. Back to that question of ADMS, I know that we talked about ADMS, and we throw those acronyms quite a bit. I know quite a few people are working on implementing ADMS systems in other utilities as well. That typically is the chief system for reliability, ensuring reliability. So when you have a DERMS, in my mind, you need to have network topology awareness. You need to know where these assets are located, where are the constraints, where are the voltage problems, what's causing the voltage problem. Is it excess drawing of power during the night because your car is charging, or is it because of PV putting out excess power? In that case, it's an over voltage. So knowing the location is key to understanding what the voltage issue is, so that way you have the solution, you have a more effective solution. But the key is that, if you are familiar with the utility industry, we love our silos, right? We have the ADMS and the reliability, real-time operations in one corner. And in the past, traditionally, we have not worried about the demand response or DERs from that corner of the company. And then on the other end, we have all of our demand response folks, which is energy conservation, DSM programs, which is another different group in the company. The DR integration is somewhere in the middle. And I think interconnection process typically tends to be a planning problem, not necessarily an operations problem, where we do this study for a site and we say this is good to go. But then when you have all these load changes happening on the grid simultaneously, you don't know if that study is valid yet. And that's why you need real-time monitoring of those DERs. Now the question is, who's going to own that, right? It's not this corner, it's not the other corner. And in my mind, the DERMS pretty much captures this entirety of all these assets that are on the grid, and then how do we use them for reliability? That's another simpler way of thinking. Again, when we talk about reliability, there's the ADMS system. Again, it's a system, it builds off of a DMS, a distribution management system. These are large platforms, typically takes 5 years to deploy. and updating the model quality, that is an ongoing process pretty much. You have to keep doing it every year. But the ADMS tends to be very fixed, right? You cannot size an ADMS to be able to take in all of the DERs that are coming online. Again, that's not the role of an ADMS. And so the DERMS we see, we have a cloud implementation. Again, a cloud system touching OT. We have all of our folks up in arms about like, how can you have a cloud system in OT? And we're trying to work through those challenges as well. But the key is that for what DERMS is supposed to do, which is taking care of this expected exponential growth in DER systems, we want this system to be scalable, not just the system as in how much data you can store, but all the algorithms and the processing capabilities that also needs to scale. And that's why a traditional ADMS system may not be the answer, and you need something that focuses on that type of thing. Similarly, with an ADMS, it typically uses DNP3 for communication. There is some backward compatibility to older communication protocols. But when we talk about DERs, we have CAN bus, we have OCPP, we have 2030.5, any number of these communication protocols. And so we want something that's capable of handling all of those. So every 3 months, we end up building adapters. And that's what JT and my team talk about all the time. What adapters are we building next? And we're trying to maximize the addition of megawatts to the platform. So what adapter has to come first? And so that way, I think the DRMS is so much more in the sense that it really helps us like to get to a place where we've been limited, right? And this is the chicken and egg problem. We don't have a solution because there is no technology. There is no technology because we haven't identified that as a problem. And I think DRMS is somewhere in between where it's evolving as we go, which I think it's not a bad thing, because the first thing that utilities or regulators would tell you is like, but we don't know what DRMS is. We don't need to know what DRMS is. You only need to know what you want to do with your DERs on the system. That being said, I think the biggest challenge that we have, I'm going to tell this in front of JT. You can hold it against me. Even within the utility, like I mentioned, we like our silos, right? And we want the DERMS program, whoever is implementing the DERMS for the utility, to be able to work across all these stakeholders. And I was just telling Lisa earlier that we have 125 people that we've identified so far that we keep in regular touch. So they are the IT owners and the business owners for each of the platforms that the DERMS is going to talk to. With DR interconnection, we have an owner for anything that's residential. We have an owner for anything between 250 kilowatts and 3 megawatts. We have a different owner for between 3 megawatts to 5 megawatts. And anything bigger is a different owner. And the processes are all different because it's a patchwork of interconnection rules and so on. And there is no database there's no one single database where you can pull all of this information. So which means we need to work with all of these stakeholders to changing their processes in a way that, that can help streamline the process going forward. Same thing with our interconnection agreements too. Like most utilities, they were very basic. But now we're starting to realize that unless you have some visibility into what the inverter is doing at the site level, it's not enough just to read the recloser information and be okay with it. You need to be able to know what the inverters are up to and so on. So that's creating additional anxiety about okay, we don't have systems to capture that type of information. How do we talk to behind the meter? How do we talk to customer sites and so on? And so those are challenges that we're trying to identify. But the key is that you need to identify your stakeholders, make sure you have ongoing, very robust stakeholder engagement process, and make sure you're capturing the requirements so we call them use cases. So that's the use case development and capturing those as requirements. But then you have to freeze the development at some point, right? Otherwise, you're going to have scope creep. So how do you go from, your stakeholders want more and more things from it, but you also want to deploy a platform you can start off with, the crawl, walk, run phase. So how do you start crawling before you think of running? So then you freeze the stakeholder requirements and so on. So it's a very there's a push and pull between what your stakeholders want versus how much the program team can deliver. And like I mentioned, the scope definition, that is an evolving theme, right? Again, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because the role of a utility is evolving, especially on the distribution side with FERC Order 2.2 and so on. So it's only fair that the DRMS as a technology, as a solution, is going to evolve with these requirements and needs. And like I said, there are plenty of industry resources. The program is expected to integrate with the DRMS And these are we said open area 2.0b. We said you should be able to provide real-time estimation, forecast of the assets, all of it available. And I think the key there is that, to your point, just knowing that you have this technology or platform streamlines what you would do on the other end. The other example is, like I said, our ADMS folks have all of the PV sites routed through the ADMS, and they don't want to deal with all of those points because it's just it's just clutter for the ADMS system itself, and it's a real-time system on its own too. Now we're talking about how do we move these over, and how do we make sure we put in a place there is a process where anytime there is a new interconnection for PV, like I mentioned, there were multiple owners, but we're streamlining the process to say anytime there is a new interconnection request, the next step has to be modeled in the DERMS system. And then we are also specifying the data bus requirements, like for the ADMS to talk with other assets, devices, like what type of models do we need, what should they look like, how do we model these assets, and how do we update the models across this team. So, that's to say, I think the minute you have that platform capable of managing DERs and DRs, it definitely brings about this process, the streamlining of not just things to do with DER, but just things to do with anything else that might be related to that as well. So there is that back and forth.
Maybe yeah, Jerry. Yes. Yep.
Which said, oh, if I'm building out this patch, that's on me.
Right.
The biggest risk in the last decade of listening to this has been, are we, the consumers or the prosumers, if you will, willing to support Santosh project by saying, Santosh, I will give you an SLA that when you want it, I will dispatch it. I think if you have, I don't know whether you have that in your.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? And so I think that's why there are two, within our company too, we have two types of demand response too. A lot of our DSM programs correspond to residential, right? Where we have thousands of smart water heaters or thousands of smart thermostats and so on, or electric vehicles for that matter. Now, of course, these are residential consumers, and so, when we call on demand response program, it's usually a very hot summer day where you have to cut, the cooling to help support the grid. And it may or may not be feasible to them. And I think that's all right? Because at the end of the day, it's comfort and the quality of life and all of that matters too. And then we have our commercial consumers where those are not necessarily DSM programs, but we have individual contracts with them. And they are required to held to a higher SLA because they actually have some curtailable load. Could be steel mills. They have some ability to run without power for a few hours. Sewage water treatment plants where you can run without those curtail load and so on. So we have specific, our refrigeration. If you have some inertia, you can let them run for a bit. And so those consumers have a higher SLA. But I think the key is it's what is the behavior at a population level, right? And we talk about a certain participation rate, 80% or 85%. So it's accounting for that when we do the planning, is to say, well, okay, I might have 1,000 customers, but so long as I'm not expecting all 1,000 customers to participate. And on average, it's 80% or 75% per event. And that's good enough too, usually, because then, at least that's what you're getting. And you're planning, you're kind of not relying on all 1,000 customers to participate. And it may not be the same 750 customers every time, but there is the stochastic nature of the problem that kind of works itself out, I think. And that, but that also comes back to what is the incentive, right? So then we learn from it and say, okay, do we need to tune the incentive to be a little better? Should it be more targeted? Should it be a bill credit versus a gift card? Or did we not do the campaigning or the marketing campaigns right? So there's a lot of push and pull again, and I think there's a lot of learning to be done.
So I think there's two parts there, right? I'll hit the incentive first, right? And we think about this, and we've had some experience with this here recently, just here in Texas, right? Because we have 164,000 home standby generators sitting in the state of Texas. We're in Travis County alone. we're installing at a rate of 20 new a week, basically, for the last year. Weather usually is a pretty good driver of that. But there's these generators that just sit idly by 99.9% of their lives. So for the other 0.1%, right, you know, they're used for emergency purposes. But for all of that time that they're sitting idly by, could they not be used as a grid resource to keep the lights on for everyone else? And so we're thinking about, like, we've done trial runs of different incentives, and the needle moves differently for people, right? Some people, they want the annual maintenance covered, which is usually about $200 to $250 a year, right? If you don't have it annually maintained, we will void that warranty with a quickness. Or others, they want an Amazon gift card. We've done the same out west in California with people with power cell batteries. And we've offered them $200 to take part in a program because the utility asked us to do it. Didn't move the needle, right? Not on a $15,000 battery. $200, like, I'm good, right? So there's the incentive part. But Jerry, the other part, and I think for our utility friends in here, right, that probably would agree, there is a hell of a lot of reluctance to do a push down SLA on a homeowner. It's one thing for a CNI, right, because you get what, I mean, they understand the rules of the game. But for a residential customer to say, hey, it's one thing to say, well, you're not going to get your bill credit. It's another one if you say, I'm going to slap a $75 fee on you because you turned your thermostat back on when I asked you not to. And most of the utilities that I've engaged with over the years, absolutely terrified to go in front of a regulator and go, yeah, I'm gonna charge JT when he turns his thermostat back on because his wife likes to hang meat in the house on a 95-degree day. So, right, so I think there's an apprehension. Now, is there an intermediate? Yeah, because some of us in this room that are aggregators of our own resources or multi-assets, we commit to SLAs in some way, shape, or form, but then there's an overbuild that always takes place, right? If we're going to commit to 5 megawatts, we probably go and recruit 8 because we know people are going to go and turn the shit off and not participate. So, I mean, it's such a gray area, and there's a reluctance on the resi side. I don't know if that will change. I mean, if the juice is worth the squeeze, maybe, right? But, I mean, you're talking about more incentives that are current than what's being offered right now. I mean, the most I've seen in a battery program where, I mean, there's not, there's no penalty, is up in the Northeast with what Eversource and National Grid are doing with the connected solutions, right? It's what, $200 per kW per year for battery to call it 60 times in the summer, which pretty much means every non-weekend, non-holiday day, June through September, right? So, I mean, and plenty of people sign up for it, so. Yes, sir.
For those penalties, are the utility partners usually on the hook for the liability of the capacity auctions and non-performance?
That's a great question because it really depends on how it's structured, right? I mean, if case in point, we are probably a little more than what should be public, but like we are, as Santosh said, we are the DERMS provider there. But another group within Dominion has also come to us and said, will you take the 2,000 power cell batteries that sit in the Dominion footprint and take them into PJM so we can show that, hey, these can participate in the day ahead or hour ahead market? It's like, well, okay, but who's at risk here? Are you gonna take the position, Dominion, or are we gonna take it and we're gonna package this up as a fee, fee-based service, right? It depends, right? I mean, in a regulated market, right, Detroit Edison's probably one that comes to mind, right? Because, right, they had their own program, 4 years ago when a winter event was called for the first time in years, like decades, and they had hundreds of megawatts sitting in your mom and dad's DR type of phone a friend, send a carrier pigeon, bat signal, and the phone lines didn't work. No one had the wrong phone numbers. They had 0 megawatts actually curtailed when they had a commitment to MISO. And guess who got penalized? DTE did. The customer did, right? Because the customer wasn't at fault. They had no way of knowing that an event was taking place, right? So, I mean, there's examples out there where you have groups that will take that position. I mean, in most cases, like in a wholesale market, it's such a gray area because even in the Northeast, right, where we work with some utilities, they're bringing their capacity into a utility program, but those same resources are also being committed to the forward capacity market in ISO, and the two don't overlap, right? And so it's a value stacking opportunity for the consumer, but the risk is being managed by the aggregator, not the utility, right? So, they're the one taking a position and the penalties that come along with that. So does that help?
Yeah.
All right. So thinking through, I'm just going to kind of look at some of these other questions here because I want to draw out maybe some things that that folks can take away some good stuff here, right? Because I'm always sensitive to that. But for those in here, like, what is still unknown about DERMS that maybe you're just like maybe you didn't hear the answer in here, right? And things that questions that you may still have, or questions or things that you still need to better understand when it comes to DERMS, right? What are some questions or thoughts or items that are still unknown to you that really need to be kind of thought through before you truly get your head around DERMS and what role you may or may not play in it, whether it's as a utility or as a partner, as an aggregator, vendor, et cetera. Yes, sir.
Yeah, how do they connect the building management systems like a Schneider, Honeywell, Johnson Control that actually have the impact at the low level from a C&I perspective, back out to the generation on the other side of the meter?
So how do they connect to the building management systems, right? Okay, that's good.
Energy flow management.
Energy flow management, I like that. All right, that's good. I like that. Thank you. What else? Other things that are unknown yet that we gotta figure out. Holy moly, you broke it. And let this be a lesson. Yoga makes you very strong. So, building management systems. And how'd you call it? Energy flow? Is that how you? Energy. Orchestrating the overall energy flow. That's good. I like that. Yes, sir. So that's a lot. So let me see if I can capture it. That's all right. That's why we're here. So are there new business models that need to be undertaken, and is the market structure in place to support it? Would that be fair? Okay. Cost recovery. Yeah, we're facing that with ADER here in Texas right now. That is for sure. I'm gonna let my sister catch up here. Look at that. Such pretty handwriting. So much better than mine. I saw Jerry. Yep.
I love when folks talk about DRMS when no two circuits are the same. Situational awareness to understand which circuits can really withstand DRMS coming on and off is actually in the Zpryme stuff. There are links that we
Okay. No. Hey, the three of us have all chewed some of the same dirt, my friend. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so residential information is great. It doesn't really make it back in full granularity back to the control systems. Where selfishly companies say that's great. If you want to know what's happening at a feeder level, what's happening at a lateral level, then the distribution transformers and I love people talking about supply chain issues. How many DGs do you have that are overloaded today? And I get crazy. Except you brought them.
IT cybersecurity. Okay.
Because it's training and technology, and like I said, most of our utility, at least on the OT side, they don't talk to customer assets.
Mm-hmm.
Then the DRMS don't have a way around it, right? So it's an OT system talking to customer own assets. So there's a communication protocol, networking, who owns the communication assets, and the cybersecurity requirements and so on.
Okay. Other unknowns, right? That we haven't discovered, uncovered, however you want to frame it. These are all good. Mm-hmm. Preach. Yeah. And friend, my friend, you have reached the reality of program design, and that I love that. That's awesome. Okay. You got somewhere you got to be? Yeah. Who else? Comment, question? Okay. Yep. Right. It's a great point. Yeah, real time. Can you define that? Does that mean like near real time? Kind of like right. Are we in cycles now? Great. Okay, good. That's awesome. I love that. All right. I guess in the last couple of minutes, what other questions should we be asking? I'm gonna take this last question here because I think that's a good one. You know, what other questions should we be asking? And you know, as we start thinking through DERMS deployments and things of you know, around, you know, getting a DERMS out, you know, whether it's a year from now or 5 years from now, right? Because we saw the data, you know, 44% are thinking about it in the next 5 years, right? What questions should we be asking that need to be asked in a you know, either internally or externally? Okay. It's a good one. There just needs to be an easy button, right? That's a good question. Yeah. Right. Do you jump from walking, or do you jump from crawling to running, right? I mean, right. Yeah, and we saw. I will say I heard a lot of that Q&A most recently at Tech Advantage for the electric cooperative space, right? Because that is an area, kind of back to your question here. It's like that the resources aren't quite there, right? Funding could be, because USDA and DOE definitely will do plenty of grant and funding for said programs, but it's kind of like, well, I don't have enough folks to take care of this. Like, no way, right? But So that's, I mean, these are good questions. These are questions that we are definitely hearing, especially when you move into more the electric cooperative space, which is, I mean, you know, one would argue that probably in many ways faster to react than the traditional IOU, right? No offense, Santosh. Awesome. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Because we're at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's, because you know it's probably coffee and cookies outside, so I don't want to stand in the way of that. Business readiness. Is the business ready? That's a great one. And that goes to a stakeholder question, too. I mean, you could actually ask each of the stakeholders, right, and making sure you've identified the stakeholders ahead of time, like, right, you know, you mentioned the program managers for these, the current and future programs, and your control center men and women, and that type of thing, right? So these are, yeah. And what change management might have to take place. Awesome. Well, gang, we'll be around. You know, we happy to entertain other questions and have conversations. Thank y'all so much for your time and attentiveness. Appreciate it.